Good afternoon. Parkside Colliery was a coal mine based here in Newton-y-Willows. Employing thousands of people during the 1960s and 70s, the pit fell victim to closure just after the end of the 1984-85 miners' strike. Today I'm asking, what were the origins of that strike, leading to the eventual closure of pits like Parkside all around the UK? Here to discuss the matter with me is Andrew Edwards, historian and commentator. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
So, straight into it. 1972, 74, Joe Gormley takes the miners out on strike. Why?
By 1972, miners' wages had fallen to about 3/4 of the industrial average. What Joe Gormley is able to do through the strikes between 72 and 74 is to take miners back to the top of the industrial workers' pay league.
And what were the effects of those strikes on the communities?
Between 72 and 74, there's no real effect. Strikers got strike pay. If anything, they wouldn't get a lot less than they were earning apart from overtime. People got free school meals, and so there'd be negligible influences.
So, 1974, Heath comes up for election on a ticket of Who Rules Britain, directly against the unions.
Well, certainly by 1974, the government of the day, led by Ted Heath, had in effect had enough of the unions and the way that they appear to be running the country, and so he did in February 1974 go to the country to ask who ruled Britain, whether it was the unions or the duly elected government of the day. For Ted Heath, it didn't work in his favour.
Why didn't it work in his favour?
I think in those days what we'd had 6 years of a Labour government between 64 and 70 under Harold Wilson. We'd had Harold Wilson supporting between 72 and 74 the miners and trade union disputes, and in the mid-70s Britain was very, very much in effect a left of centre nation.
Watching from the sidelines as this was occurring is the Education and Science Secretary, Mrs Thatcher, and she becomes leader of the opposition in 75. I suggest that she now formulated an agenda to deal with the unions.
She'd certainly got an agenda for making sure that what happened to Ted didn't happen to her. I'm not convinced that in 75, when she became leader, that she had an agenda for dealing with the unions. Of course she would have to deal with them, but it was a long way away yet before she actually has to come into government in order to deal with the unions. In opposition you can make an awful lot of noises, but you can't actually formulate government policy.
Well, yes, 4 years later she becomes Prime Minister, and she's determined to avoid the pitfalls of what the Heath government went through, and so she enters a period of negotiation with the miners to some degree.
I don't think I agree with your point that she's determined not to let what happened to Ted happen to her, but I don't think she saw herself negotiating. Certainly on becoming Prime Minister, she developed an industrial policy that was going to try to, they would say, that's the Conservative government, deal with the trade unions. Remember, she's entered office on the back of the winter of discontent that has toppled another government, this time the Labour government, led by Jimmy Callaghan. And so she's determined that what happened to them, Jimmy and Ted, was not going to happen to her.
And to some degree quite successfully, because really nothing happens between the governments. There's a standoff more than anything. But what does interrupt Mrs Thatcher and the unions is the Falklands War.
There is a standoff. For example, there's a steel strike that doesn't go anywhere, but there are successful, from the government's point of view, trade union reforms. there are successful trade union reforms in the sense of you cannot anymore have a strike just on a show of hands in the works canteen or in the works car park. It now has to be one member, one vote, and that means that it's a shock to the trade unions to actually have to have a list of their members. That is what we might think of as modest trade union reform. We're seen as quite radical in the early 1980s. I certainly agree with you that on winning the Falklands War, Mrs. Thatcher was returned to office in 1983 stronger than ever before.
So no matter what the unions were going to throw at her, should they choose, having so much support, she was in a strong position to deal with anything they asked. But nonetheless, the government quietly began to stockpile coal in vast quantities, just to hedge their bets.
I don't think it's to hedge their bets. I think that by the time Labour loses the 1983 general election, they're in no position as they had been when they were in opposition previously in the mid-1970s. You've got Labour in opposition in the mid-1970s where they're encouraging trade unions to strike, but in 1983 they're so small as an opposition, they've only got 209 members of parliament, that they're in no way, that they can't encourage unofficial trade union action, which they did do in the mid-1970s. So what you've got is Mrs. Thatcher being able to take further trade union reforms, and those included secret ballots. And no, not only did you have to have one member, one vote, but it had to be a secret ballot before you took industrial action.
Nonetheless, coal stocks still build up, and also a new player comes in, Mr. Arthur Scargill, and it isn't long before he takes the miners out on strike without a ballot in the summer of '84.
Well, there is a ballot, there's just not a correct ballot. Arthur Scargill, if you hear him speak, will say that we did have a ballot, but it was area by area. He didn't accept the trade union reforms. That doesn't mean he can pick and choose, though, the laws that he obeys or doesn't obey. So he's got an area ballot, which gives him, he says, his mandate, whereas the government and the opposition say it's not a legitimate ballot because it's not a national ballot. And what I say is that in doing that, Mr. Scargill is leading his miners into an industrial dispute they can't win, because there's no support from railway workers or from the petrol workers that had been in the mid-70s for Joe Gormley. So there was power all the way through. No power cuts like there was in 1974. There's no TV going off at 10:30 like there was in '74, and there's no secondary action going on like there was in 1974. So Mr. Scargill is very much on his own, even though there's a great deal of support from the wider trade union movement, but it's more in kind rather than in direct support.
And I suppose what else was undermining Mr. Scargill's attempts to gain more power is the imports of Australian and Polish coal, which were a lot cheaper to bring in and to bring in the news, I suppose.
I think with Australian and Polish coal, you raise a very good point that it is usable coal. It's coal that can be burned in UK power stations. The Australians have the advantage that it's open cast, so there's no costs. At Parkside and other such pits, there'd be health and safety at work issues, there would be tunnelling issues, there'd be flooding issues. None of that in Australia. It's all open cast from the ground. In Poland, they have got health and safety issues, they've got flooding issues, they've got collapse issues, collapse of tunnels and seams. What's there though is an Eastern Bloc country in 1985, desperate for Western currency, and Western currency, it can have Western currency by selling Britain as much coal as Britain could take. So I do agree with you, and they, together with the coal stocks and a warm summer, really did help to defeat the miners of the day.
So by 1985, the miners are a spent force more than anything else, and begin to drift back to work in drips and drabs, to find that there's no work for them.
Well, there's no work for them because their pits are irrevocably damaged. They're damaged through flooding, they're damaged through collapses, they're damaged through health and safety at work issues, because you can't work in a flooded or a collapsed pit, and some of the roofs have collapsed, and it's easier to get coal from Poland than from Australia, rather than rebuild or re-engineer a pit like Parkside or any of the other pits. It's just not economically feasible to put as much money into doing that than it is to import coal. And so it's at that tipping point that the government says, no, we're going to close over 100 pits, and goes ahead with its pit closures, which of course it wasn't going to do if the miners hadn't gone on strike, because the pits would have still been there and still been producing coal today.
And was that a gambit on Mr. Scargill's part, or just an oversight on their part, that it's fine to turn up and find their mines would be in ruins, essentially?
Mr. Scargill, in my view, was just outmanoeuvred by the government, and the collapse of pits through exhaustion or through a lack of proper maintenance was unforeseen, I say. I think that they were expecting the National Coal Board to maintain them, or British Coal to maintain them better than they did. But of course, without the workers there was not the workforce to be able to maintain them to a standard that made them economical.
Certainly a sting in the tail. Well, thank you, Mr. Edwards, and a thank you from Mutiny Willows. Goodbye for now.